This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And here's the sad remembrance of his life, the scarf, which for his sake I will forever wear. We hear these words spoken by by Boccaccio, a character in The Atheist Tragedy, a play by the Jacobean author Cyril Tourneur. These two lines of text are so powerful in conferring such resonance to a relatively simple object, a scarf. Yet it shows how an object that once had proximity to the body of its wearer could be used by another to represent the life and indeed essence of the deceased. As an aside, it does emerge that Charlemagne is not actually dead, and reports to the contrary were widely falsified. But nevertheless, this in no way diminishes the emotion attached to the scarf for Boccaccio as he speaks to the young man's father. In life, then, clothing and textiles were used to construct an identity, and within Renaissance discourse, we find numerous references to such ideas. Take, for example, this image from the first book of the Introduction of Knowledge by the English physician Andrew Boord. It shows an Englishman, naked, carrying shears and cloth, and therefore able to fashion himself according to his whims and desires. The first part of the accompanying text reads, "I am an Englishman, and naked I stand here, musing in my mind what raiment I shall wear. For now I will wear this, and now I will wear that. Now I will wear, I cannot tell what, all new fashions be pleasant to me." While this is a satirical comment on the inability of the English to form a distinct identity, and so reflecting contemporary fears of a threat to a national identity, it signals how what we choose to adorn our body with can constitute our very being. A recent exhibition at the Bowes Museum in Barnard Castle in County Durham, which closed only a month ago, explored this very idea. Material Remains was conceived by the artist Diana Winkfield, who discovered a number of hidden garments and objects in varying states of decay as she renovated her farmhouse in rural Auvergne in France. The exhibition touched upon the notion of memory as it is evoked by concealed, worn and tattered clothes and shoes, visualising this through paintings, drawings and installations incorporating these found objects. Like those of us who work with objects, Winkfield made close observations of these found objects, paying close attention to their colour, fabric, shape, texture, condition and origins to reveal a jumble of memories which unravel and weave real and supposed stories. So while it is clear that clothing is associated with an individual's identity through its proximity to the body, as is further attested to by a rather gruesome discovery from the Mary Rose of a disintegrated garment with threads of red silk attached to a spine from a skeleton, possibly that of an officer on board the ship when it sank in 1545, what I would like to discuss today is how identity was also inextricably linked to other items of material culture, and more specifically, jewellery. So now I turn to another literary reference, this time Shakespeare's All's Well That Ends Well. When Bertram presents the king with a ring that once belonged to Helena, the king is convinced of her death. He says, "She called the saints to surety that she would never put it from her finger, unless she gave it to yourself in bed, where you have never come, or sent it us upon her great disaster." He continues, "And she is dead, which nothing but to close her eyes myself could win me to believe, more than to see this ring." For the king, the physical distance between the ring and its owner could only mean one of two things: either Helena had died, or that she willingly gave up the ring to Bertram upon succumbing to him. And so retaining this ring is clearly pivotal to Helena's character and identity, for being separated from it alters her very state of existence. Either she is lifeless and therefore devoid of her identity, or in a contracted union and thus has assumed a new identity as a wife to a man of more noble birth. Since the king is unable to accept that Bertram would have taken Helena as his wife, he immediately begins to mourn her death. That a small object, such as a ring, can be so evocative, able to carry the memory of an individual, is not only present in literary sources. We simply need to look at the wills of early modern citizens to see how an item of jewellery had an emotional value that far exceeded any monetary worth that could be measured in terms of the raw materials from which it was made. The testamentary wishes of citizens provide clear insight into the relationships that were forged during an individual's lifetime, marking out as special those connections that were maintained even after death through bequests. Now, what we need to remember at this point is that jewellery did have a fiscal value, no matter how small, and that very often this value was unlocked in the selling of pieces. So when we do read 16th and early 17th and 17th century wills that include bequests of such highly personal possessions destined for friends and family, we must realise how important these relationships were, important enough to outweigh any financial benefits potentially gained from the sale of such items. The 1567 will of William Herbert, the first Earl of Pembroke, serves as an example where some of his jewelled possessions are bequeathed while others are sold. His daughter, Anne Talbot, receives 500 marks in money and in jewels, while the remainder of all his movable goods, including jewels, are left to his son and heir Henry Herbert, second Earl of Pembroke. On the night before his death, Pembroke made an addendum to his will, crucially allowing for his wife to keep all of her jewels, and also bequeathing to the Queen's Majesty his best jewel, which he named his Great Ballas. On the same night, the following provision was made: that the residue of his jewels not bequeathed be sold by his son and heir Henry Lord Herbert of Cardiff, to be employed in such uses as his lordship meant if he had lived. In this final act, then, Pembroke reduced many of his jewelled possessions to their mere economic value, but it may be that after he'd given his most prized objects to those he esteemed most greatly, he realised that he could unlock a considerable store of wealth for some charitable good. But now I want to look at how bequests of jewellery were used to evoke the memory of the deceased. This is perhaps most evocative in the naming of 4 heirloom jewels by the statesman Sir Thomas Sackville, jewels intended to keep his memory alive in the minds of his descendants. Sackville is perhaps best known for the role he played in the negotiation of peace between England and Spain at the Somerset House Conference in 1604, an event immortalised in this painting from the National Portrait Gallery. The English delegation is seated to the right of the picture as we view the painting, and Sackville is the figure placed furthest from the viewer's gaze. This portrait of Sackville, dated to 3 years earlier, has always struck me for the very sombre nature of the Earl's Dress. It stands in complete opposition to what we read in his will, made only months before he died in April 1608. Apart from a pendant worn around his neck, Sackville wears no other jewellery, yet in writing down his final wishes, he refers to a number of jewels that were seemingly worn by him. 4 of these are bequeathed to his eldest son and heir, Robert Sackville, 2nd Earl of Dorset. I've put up the full descriptions here of these heirloom pieces, but perhaps in the interest of time, I'll just summarise what we have here. So the first is a gold ring, which is enamelled black and set with 20 diamonds. We then have an agate cameo of Queen Elizabeth, and that's set within a gold frame, set with 26 rubies and a pearl hanging pendant at the base. Then we have a second gold ring, also enamelled black. This time it's set with a single large table-cut diamond. And then finally, a gold chain described as being of Spanish work. This doesn't actually mean that it was made in Spain. Spanish work usually indicated that it was a very heavy-set item of jewellery with lots of ornate scroll work. And this has white enamelling and a number of diamonds. In Sackville's will, the description of each object is prefaced by the phrase, "the sole use and occupation only." As such, while these items of jewellery were indeed bequeathed to Robert, they did not become his property for him to dispose of as he wished, a fact made explicit by the assertion that Robert was to have these jewels during his life only. Sackville's intentions are made clear when he states that following Robert's death, these same 4 jewels were to pass to Robert's heir, Richard Sackville, the 3rd Earl of Dorset, again for and during his life only. Sackville continues his instructions and states that, and I quote, "the said 2 rings, picture and chain of gold are intended by me to remain as our heirlooms to the house and family of the Sackvilles." Sackville recounts how he came to be in possession of each of these objects. The agate cameo was a bequest from his sister Lady Anne Dacre and is described as being very fitting, being a cameo of Elizabeth. Sackville's role within Elizabeth's court was very prominent, and so his sister thought that this gift would serve as a very strong reminder of how successful Sackville had been during Elizabeth's lifetime. The other 3 gifts are all royal gifts. The first ring with the 20 diamonds was a gift from James I, and Sackville recounts a very interesting tale of how only months before he eventually died, he had taken very sick, and reports had reached London of this sickness. And he describes how James had sent a messenger with this beautiful gold and diamond ring to him with the following message that, I hope that with this ring you will be cured of all your ailments. And then Sackville continues to say, and it did cure me. So, he really attributes this to the ring, which is lovely. And then the chain and the diamond ring, with the single diamond, were from Philip III of Spain. And these were royal gifts given for the role that Sackville had in brokering the peace between England and Spain in 1604. So in providing these details, Sackville ensured that each object was endowed with a strong narrative, one that he hoped would ensure retention of these important gifts and keep a remembrance of himself alive in the minds of his descendants. But bequests of jewellery were not limited to men of Sackville's status. It is true that the quantity and quality of the jewels he owned were great, but ordinary citizens did often own items of jewellery. While bequests of such a nature are often limited, they are clear reminders that a desire for remembrance was no less marked amongst the non-elites, and that even the smallest of objects had the power to carry on the memory of an individual. The act of passing on personal property to family and friends both signalled and reinforced the bonds of kinship that were formed over a lifetime. And so in 1527, the Lincolnshire mercer John Leake left a number of items to Alice Arley, including his late wife's wedding ring, which then served as a tangible reminder of his wife, himself, and of their union. A group of early 16th century wills from the Diocese of London shows that while ownership of jewellery provides further evidence of how the memory of the deceased evoked in the bequeathing of material artefacts was intensified through the bequest of jewels, since the highly personal nature of such objects and the proximity to the body only served to increase the status of these gifts. So just take a few examples from this group, because I know it's slightly outside of the date range of this conference. In 1510, the chaplain Robert Steele bequeathed 2 silver clasps to one of his executors, and a silver clasp with a crucifix to a fellow chaplain. And very often, rhetoric indicates the status of these bequests. And so when we read that in 1516, the clerk Robert Andrews leaves to one of his 2 executors his ring of gold with a sapphire ballast, and his wreathed ring of gold with a ballast therein, we can only assume that Thomas Rochford was a particularly favoured kinsman. Similarly, in 1537, the surgeon Anthony Coppage leaves my ring to Dr. Lay's brother, and the wife of a certain Thomas Austin receives the ring that is upon my finger. Now, moving away from bequests of objects that were actually owned and used by the deceased allows us to witness the particular measures that were taken by early modern citizens to preserve an individual's memory. Within these documents, a certain level of convention was adhered to, and we find that the preambles are fairly formulaic, with a wish for the soul to be bequeathed to God and the provision of money to pay towards regular prayers and intercessions. These not only aided the soul of the departed to enter heaven, but also provided for continued remembrance. While these acts of remembrance were important, there were other steps that could be taken to preserve one's memory through more tangible means. The historian Keith Thomas points out that, and I quote, "Many of the central social practices of the early modern period, from publishing books to commissioning portraits, become more intelligible when they are seen as the product of this concern with posthumous reputation." And so we read in the published account of the sermon given at the time of the death of Henry Grey, 6th Earl of Kent, in 1614, that his most overt and lasting legacy was a mausoleum founded in 1605 as an emblem to his posterity. Yet however imposing such objects were, large-scale gestures of this sort were not accessible to all. Common practice in the more early modern period seems to have been the provision of money in wills for the creation of mourning rings, which played a mnemonic role through their representation. Shakespeare followed this tradition, and in his will dated the 25th of March 1616, he provides the sum of 26 shillings 8 to 7 individuals for the purchase of rings. Although the will does not define these rings as mourning rings, and in fact the term does not become into first use until 1653, it remained clear that the purpose of each man's ring was to serve as a remembrance of the playwright. In many instances relating to the bequests of mourning rings, very little detail is given about the rings themselves. And so the will of Lady Anne Newdigate is fascinating for the detail it provides. In addition to stipulating that the rings were each to cost 10 or 12 shillings, Lady Newdigate sets out that they should also have, I quote, a pansy, being my father's crest, engraven on the outside, and 2 letters for my name enamelled with black on either side of the pansy, and an inscription within to be in Latin, these words following: "Death is the beginning of life." A will from the preceding century and dated the 27th of November 1538 provides for the making of 30 gold rings worth 5 shillings each, which rings shall be marked with an R and a C. Roger Corbett then adds that these were to be given to several and trusty friends for a remembrance. There was no real prescribed form for mourning rings, since what mattered was the context that governed how and why the ring came into being that determined its type. Nevertheless, later in the 17th century, conventions do begin to apply, and these rings are usually inscribed inside the hoop with the initials, the date of death, and sometimes the age of the deceased. Emblems typically used on memento mori devices such as death's heads, crossbones, skeletons, and hourglasses populate the outer face of the hoop and are enamelled. The inscription on this ring tells us that it was made in memory of a certain SP who died on the 4th of November 1685 at the age of only 21. This mourning ring, dated to 1690, was discovered by a member of the public using a metal detector in 2008 and is typical of many late 17th century survivals. It is formed of a flat gold band with a skull engraved to its outer surface, while inside it is inscribed, "Prepare to follow F.V. Obit 16th of May 1670. This ring is not unusual since it is characteristic of other contemporary mourning rings, but its interest lies in the fact that documentary evidence exists to strongly suggest that the identity of the individual referred to in the inscription is Sir Francis Vincent Baronet. He died on the 16th of May 1670, and this is recorded in the parish registers for Stoke Dabenham in Surrey. His will dates to 1669, and there are a number of bequests of mourning rings. It would be impossible to say with certainty that the ring we see today is in fact one of these rings mentioned by Sir Francis, such as the one to his sister Catherine Vane, worth £10, or the one to Matthew Carlton, worth 3, or his wife 40 shillings. But there is no reason why it could not be. It is unlikely, though, that a ring weighing only 3.4 grams would be valued at £10, and so if it is one of the rings described, it is most likely to be that of Matthew Carlton or his wife. With mourning rings, we must remember that these had never been the property of the testator. The bequest therefore functioned in a way that was different to gifts of jewels that had been used during the lifetime of the deceased. Instead, mourning rings reflected a strong desire to be remembered by those with whom an individual had formed close and strong social bonds. And so it was through their very materiality that these rings evoked the memory of the deceased among the living. And so just to sum up in a few words, what we can understand from early modern wills and bequests of jewels is that there was a clear desire for remembrance that cut right across the social scale, whether in the creation of heirloom jewels by an earl, through a simple bequest of a chaplain's silver clasps, or in the provision of money by a playwright for the making of mourning rings. What all these objects have in common is the ability to carry on the memory of an individual in a very real and tangible way. Thank you.